Some RPGs get insane mainstream recognition, and some kind of remain sleeper hits. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, the 10 best RPGs that are always ignored. Now we have to start with a quick disclaimer on this one. We had to set up a couple of ground rules for this list. This list isn't in any particular order because these are all really good games, and they're predominantly games from 2010 and up. And finally, we're saving JRPGs for another video in the future. That all said, let's get started off with number 10, Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. Basically, if you combine an Elder Scrolls game with God of War, that's what this game is. And it's a game that works really well. It has this really cool combat system where you accumulate fate points, which allows you to shift into Reckoning mode, which is kind of a bullet time mode. And then there's finishing moves that are beyond cool. There's also a lot of fun in the class building in this game, but part of the reason this game never really got the kind of attention it deserved is that it was made by a company that was essentially just a vanity project from some executive. A retired executive got up one day and said, "I want to start a video game company." And it just so happened this guy was friends with NYT bestselling author R.A. Salvatore, Spawn creator Todd McFarlane, and Elder Scrolls Oblivion lead designer Ken Rolston, and asked them if they all wanted to be part of it, and they were like, yeah, sure. I'm sure he paid them pretty well too. He got like $75 million as a loan to start this company. But they made this game and they filed the company for bankruptcy, and it never really had the kind of support it needed. THQ Nordic actually recently bought the rights and is releasing a remaster in September. Maybe they will market it in a manner that gets it the attention it kind of deserves, but if not, still, like, play this game. It's one I'm sure you will enjoy if the description sounded interesting. At number 9 is Alpha Protocol. This is actually a game we've talked about before because it's kind of a strange one, but a really interesting one. It billed itself as the espionage RPG, and although there are a couple of minor flaws in how the combat in this game works, the cover system was a little inconsistent. It didn't feel like anything had particular weight, but this is also a game that comes together as a much better package than any of its singular elements. But particularly, it just has a very interesting story and very good role-playing systems in place. The way dialogue works in the game is actually very interesting. You're not given a lot of time to make dialogue choices, and it kind of always had specific consequences in the game. Some choices that you may not even realize had very large consequences.
What you do now, huh? Kill me? That not get your missiles back.
And in the end, some of its imperfections actually work to its advantage, as it's a game that has so much charm and obvious love put into it. It's something that kind of has to be revisited, and you can kind of clearly see some of the recent Deus Ex games' influence in it. And honestly, if Microsoft has any brains, they'll try to get a sequel or at least a remake of some kind of Alpha Protocol to get made. Now that they own Obsidian, that would be great. At number 8 is Divinity Original Sin 2, a game that, yes, is actually pretty successful, but although we've talked about it a lot on this channel, are you as likely to be able to bring it up at Thanksgiving as you are to Dark Souls? Probably not, but it kind of deserves that, and that's why we're bringing it up in this list. If you talk to a critic about Divinity Original Sin 2, they will rant and rave about how amazing it is. But is it a household name? No, and it should be. And it's because among the types of games, it is the sort of isometric Baldur's Gate style, kinda 90s CRPG type game. It's probably the best one in recent memory, and there were some really good ones in recent memory. It just let you customize so much about it. It gave you so much freedom to sort of build your character, build within systems, and it had such a great story that I just think it deserves to be one of those games that's much, much bigger than it is, even though it's not like a small game that we've never talked about before. At number 7 is Demon's Souls, which we're going to notate is a small exception to the rules in that it's 2009 when this game came out. Demon's Souls kind of has always lived in the shadow of its more successful successor, Dark Souls, and there's a remake of it coming sometime in the future that's probably going to be frigging amazing. and might get this game the kind of recognition it deserves, but Demon's Souls is kind of a weirder Dark Souls. It's just a little stranger, a little more goofy, not necessarily in that it has like a sense of humor or anything. It's still pretty grim. But Demon's Souls laid so much of the groundwork for Dark Souls, as well as had its own cool systems, like character tendency and world tendency, which would change how difficult the game is depending on how you treated NPCs and how many times you died. And having different tendencies could unlock different areas of the game. I mean, it was just a really interesting game. I cannot wait for the remake, personally. At number 6 is Grim Dawn, which is kind of a Diablo-like game set in an apocalyptic fantasy world. And it got a lot of praise as being kind of a quote-unquote spiritual successor to Diablo 2. But something that I think is unique to it is that one of the points of the game is to rebuild the world, where you're kind of going around Diabloing your way through a bad post-apocalyptic situation with the purpose of putting back together a world that is on the brink of humanity's extinction. You rebuild structures, you rescue people, and secure resources and stuff that isn't really normally thought about in these types of post-apocalyptic games. But like, you do all this stuff as like a badass who is just plowing their way through this huge Diablo 2 style quest. It's just a great game. Number 5 is Outward, an open world RPG where it also brought in a lot of survival elements. And this is a game that just had a really interesting look to it. It's not like particularly detailed or anything, but was really willing to go different as far as color schemes and character style. It has this really interesting spell casting system that's really, really in-depth. And it had really interesting co-op, which you could do online or as couch co-op split screen. Honestly, I would just call it kind of like a different experience for an RPG, because it takes so many of the things that you think about an RPG and just does them in a different way. In some ways, it's even hard to describe because it would just sound like describing an RPG. But rest assured, it's really a different title that does all of the things it does very well. It's still worth the $40 on Steam. I would go for it. And number 4 is Kingdom Come Deliverance, which was a game that, I mean, it really tried to do a lot as far as kind of being Witcher without the mysticism. Set itself during the times of the Roman Empire and tried to be as historically accurate as is possible for a game. So you have to keep in mind that, I mean, it still has to be fun on some level, so some things aren't completely historically accurate. But the combat was really good in it. The story was really in-depth and really tried to use its historical setting to the full extent. But it also threw a lot at you, and it was at times pretty difficult. And I think that that made it harder for it to get the mainstream recognition it really deserves. But this game was obviously a lot of work, and so much went into it. The final product is one of those games where you're just like, I'm frustrated, but I can't put it down. At number 3 is Battle Chasers Night War, which is a game you probably never heard of. It got very little attention for how good it actually is. Like, let's just say what this is. It is an absolutely beautiful, incredibly unique, dungeon crawling, turn-based, kinda JRPG-ish, kinda CRPG-ish, just overall really different game that at the same time seems incredibly familiar in every way. I wouldn't call it directly a JRPG, but it's obviously very inspired by it. But it's also very inspired by D&D. And if you just looked at how the dungeons look, aside from the art style, you'd probably think it was a Diablo clone. But it's so colorful, beautiful, and the gameplay is so engrossing. This is a game that you have to play if you haven't heard of it. And you think, oh, well, a JRPG might be cool. Or a dungeon crawler might be cool. It's all of that and more. Battle Chasers Night War is a fantastic game that deserved way more recognition than it got. At number 2 is Greedfall, which was this very strange colonial RPG, which was set in a fantasy world. And you go to this island to colonize it, and you either end up on the side of the natives or yourself. And that sounds pretty straightforward, but again, this is also a game steeped in mysticism. Honestly, this is just a beautiful game that does such an interesting job of taking something that, honestly, it's kind of grim content. Colonization is actually pretty violent and awful, and it makes you make decisions about it. And I will tell you, it just does such a great job at it. This is one of those games that you have to play it to understand just how enjoyable it is, because it's not something that you would look at and go, oh, I'll bet that's super fun. It actually looks pretty involved when you just glance at it. And it is, but it's also a lot of fun. And what it makes the player actually confront within themselves, honestly, I kind of wish more people had to. And maybe that's just me saying something should be more popular because it makes you actually consider things and make decisions for yourself that a lot of things just don't. And it's a fantastic game. You should play it if you haven't. I loved Greedfall. And finally, number 1 is Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, which is a hack and slash that comes to us from Capcom. And although the graphics are kinda dated and might turn a few people off, however, the game itself is really why you're playing it, not the graphics. It's an open world action RPG that are integrated so well. Like, you're upgrading armor, you're upgrading skills, you're sort of trying to develop a character that has this straightforward usefulness to it. Obviously, that's an oversimplification, but this game has so much detail in its gameplay that you would be forgiven for not even noticing the story, but the story is actually pretty interesting as well. It takes a little while for the story to get going also, but I think they do a good job making you sort of get into the gameplay mechanics before the story really picks up, because you do need to understand this game. And I think that that's kind of a pacing choice that makes it a little less accessible to a mainstream audience. But once the game gets going, it's something that's of a quality that deserves more attention. Few bonus games as well. We're going to bring up Dragon Age Inquisition, even though it was technically a pretty big success. Could it have been a bigger success? Probably. I mean, it was the most successful launch in BioWare history, but it's also a game that's just kind of disappeared. A lot of RPGs of its caliber we're still talking about years later, but it also came out around a time a lot of other big titles came out, and I think that kind of has clouded our memory of it a little bit. Huge game, huge response immediately. Maybe let's talk about it more nowadays. This is good. Looking back on it, I really loved that game. Next one is Child of Light, which was actually kind of a JRPG-derived idea. It was a really cool game in that it was a side-scroller that at first glance would seem to be like a platformer of some kind. It is not in any way. It's kind of an in-depth JRPG type game with an active time battle system that resembles Grandia a bit. Like, if you timed moves well, you could knock enemies' turns back, and that was just awesome. And To the Moon, which is kind of a JRPG as well, although there's not really a lot of battle stuff in it. It's more of an adventure game that uses a more JRPG framework than a typical adventure game. It's about trying to fulfill the dream of an elderly man that 2 doctors have entered the memories of. And I mean, just play this one. It's not like super involved, but it's a really interesting and amazing game. And that's all for now. Do you ever think about how these games all deserve maybe a bit more credit than they got? Leave us a comment, let us know. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. The best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable all notifications. And as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.